on today's World Insight. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak takes office amid rising fuel and food prices, seeking to ease the cost of living crisis. How are markets reacting? Could Prime Minister Sunak succeed where his Conservative Party predecessors failed?
The elevation of Rishi Sunak to be the new Prime Minister is the decision the Conservative Party should have taken in the first place.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, takes office on Tuesday as Britain's third Prime Minister this year. He's facing economic crisis that battered the financial markets and left millions of Britons struggling to pay their food and energy bills. Mr. Sunak clinched the Conservative Party leadership on Monday, seen as a safe pair of hands that could bring stability after the brief term of Liz Truss. Sunak is UK's first Prime Minister of colour and the youngest Prime Minister in more than 200 years. He pledged to restore trust, rebuild confidence, and lead the country through the crisis. Could the new British Prime Minister indeed deliver his promises? Could he succeed where his Conservative predecessors failed? Let's ask our panelists. Joining us in London, Ian Begg, professor from the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Brussels, Nicholas White, who is the senior director of the APCO's Brussels office. In Beijing, Wang Yiwei, Rang Monnet chair professor and director of the Center for EU Studies from Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Professor Begg, a new prime minister, certainly big goals being set for the time in the office.
Strange times in British politics. Just a very quick reflection that between 1979 and 2007, Britain had 3 prime ministers. Between July this year and now, we've had 3 prime ministers. So there's something going seriously wrong in the way British politics is conducting itself. Having said that, I think that the elevation of Rishi Sunak to be the new Prime Minister is the decision the Conservative Party should have taken in the first place, because he is serious. He is regarded as one of the grown-ups within the party, and I think that we will now see a renewed stability in British politics, at least for the next 2 years until a likely general election.
What do you mean by renewed stability? What is backing a confident statement like this?
Well, he's done the things that his 2 predecessors should have done, which is to bring into the government a cross-section of the different segments of the Conservative Party. He's also set out an agenda which is realistic, in stark contrast to what Liz Truss had done during her 7 weeks in office. What he's trying to do is to address the very difficult problems now confronting the UK. There is the cost of living as one of the top items, but there's also going to be a major problem in dealing with the legacy of COVID, in particular in the British healthcare system, where we're told there are something like 7 million people waiting for treatment. That's on a population of 70 million. All right, so some of these statistics can be a bit exaggerated. It may be somebody's waiting to have a toe dealt with, but there are also serious cases which have to be considered. So this is back to normal government after the helter-skelter years of Boris Johnson and the wholly unrealistic proposals that Liz Truss had put forward.
Mr. White, we have seen the Prime Minister of the UK very quickly assembled his team already, and also make a very calm statement at the very beginning of his term. What does that tell us about the goals he has in mind? Where is that likely to lead the party he belongs to?
Quite a number of the senior ministers in the government have remained in place or have returned to places that they occupied very recently. Sitting in Brussels, I was struck that the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, has stayed in. He was appointed by Liz Truss at the beginning of her term. And so has the Secretary for Northern Ireland, which is my home territory, which is also very important from the European perspective, and the Minister for Defence, Ben Wallace. So this is sending a signal of not just continuity, but responsibility. The three of them were seen as among the less radical, less excitable members of the Liz Truss government. Now they may not be so much, they may be more in the middle of the spectrum of the Sunak government. I think the message that is being sent is one of continuity, but careful continuity. This is not a government that is intending to surprise anybody. And part of the reason that Liz Truss went so badly wrong was that she started off by surprising people.
Of course, it's not just about the styles, but also the society in which the politicians are maneuvering. We have seen some dramatic moments that have gained a certain momentum for certain politicians earlier. Do you see there is likely to be a society in which going to nurture a sort of common sense politics in a way? I remember very clearly the Prime Minister coming into the office suggesting that his generation should not leave the debt to the next generation and should be responsible, as both of you indicated. So, Mr. White, do you see there is enough oxygen for so-called common sense politics and normal politics?
I think the room for manoeuvre is very small. The amount of spare capacity in the British economy, the amount of spare capacity that the British state structures have is very limited. And I'm not sure if it's quite appreciated at the top levels of government just how big that gap is. The government was elected in 2019, 3 years ago now, on a promise of levelling up, of bringing more prosperity to the poorer areas of England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, on the basis that London has generally been the target of government policies and has left the rest of the country behind. That was the Johnson plan. He didn't implement it because of COVID and because of his own limitations. Truss was not interested in that. But Sunak has now reappointed to be in charge of that process Michael Gove, who actually does have ideas. So we will see. I think if anybody is capable of finding a way to unlock that puzzle, it is probably Gove. But the difficulties are very huge. The British system doesn't favour that kind of manoeuvring. Here in Europe, we laugh now when the British tell us how their political system guarantees stable government, and the European electoral systems will always deliver chaos. I think in recent months, it possibly has been the other way around.
I'm sure on that, Professor Beck has also some thoughts.
There's something of a paradox in what's gone on, which is that it became very clear very quickly that Liz Truss was not fit to be Prime Minister. She just didn't have the capacity. She was appointed by the Conservative Party. All the problems we've seen in the last 2 years, 3 years, have been internal to the Conservative Party, which in the British constitutional system has the right, because it has a majority in the House of Commons, to appoint the Prime Minister. And it very quickly became clear that Liz Truss could not do the job well. To maybe be a bit more positive about this, the strength of the system was that once her lack of capacity was recognised, she was booted out very quickly. And I think that's the paradox. The instability demonstrates a capacity to change horse in the middle of the race in a way which many other systems cannot.
Professor Wang, how do you see the nature of China-UK relations? From Chinese perspective, how much expectation is there for the new Prime Minister to be able to pave the way for at least a stable relationship between the two countries?
I think the UK took a leading role in the West, recognize the People's Republic of China. Secondly, UK actually has very huge potential for cooperation with China, because UK is comparative advantage is finance. So China actually also of the RMB internationalization. UK take the leading role, join the AIIB. After the Brexit, actually, who can replace the single market of the European Union for the UK's economy? I think China, definitely. With the high level of the open reform, we need to deal with the economic business relations separate from the ideology and the security disputes.
Professor Begg, about the economy, everybody now is trying to deal with the post-COVID world and the economic crisis or challenges combined with energy crisis, food crisis, as well as further layered by geopolitics are making things ever more complicated. How do you expect this new Prime Minister, together with his cabinet, be able to swim in this turbulent water?
There is a clear, what we call in academic world, trilemma, that they want to cut taxes, they want to increase public expenditure, but they also want not to have to increase the debt. And you can't do all three simultaneously. So I think it's going to be a navigation between these three different areas, which is a very difficult navigation because the strait through which you're trying to navigate is very narrow. The package to curb gas prices does have a very important consequence, which is that it reduces the headline rate of inflation from what it would otherwise be. I think in any case, it looks as though Europe is doing quite well in securing gas supplies. And what we should expect to see over the coming months, always with the caveat of not knowing what Putin will do next, is the gas price beginning slowly to fall. And that dynamic component of the increase in inflation will go in the other direction as a result. So falling inflation should start to happen maybe over the next 6 months. And that will ease many of the problems. Also, Sunak's impression that he's given to the markets of competence has immediately had an effect on the financing costs of British debt. What was described in some circles in the financial markets in London as the moron premium, the idiocy premium, because of what Liz Truss and her Chancellor had done, that has gone the other direction now. It's now seen as a competence premium going in favor of British debt rather than against British debt. So I think that we'll see some easing of the problems, but you still have to address the underlying ones, which is low productivity growth, the fact that the labour supply is very constrained in the UK, and that in turn is partly because the health system has not been able to treat people, those with long COVID, those who had postponement of other treatments, fast enough to ensure the labour supply is growing. So there is a conjunction of problems that is not easy to resolve.
At this moment, Professor Wang, we see China-EU relations is pretty much in the air for further decisions coming from both sides. We also see a complex, how shall I say, complex decision-making process from the side of the European countries regarding its relations with Russia, regarding its relations besides the United States and several of the other Commonwealth countries. So how do you see the UK right now, with the change of administration, is going to articulate their relationship with the EU's general foreign policy and seeking out their best opportunities?
Well, we hope so, but Mr. Sunak have the limitations. Firstly, his eyes is more on the Conservative Party reached consensus, unity, solidarity, and also for the British people. And also, I think the constraints, so many constraints for him. 2024, the general election, and so many agendas on busy agenda. So I think his personal views about China, the relations with the world, he cannot conduct freely because of so many constraints from his colleagues and also his people.
Professor Begg?
Yes, I think Professor Wang is correct that it's not as though one individual can dominate foreign policy in the way you might think with an extremely powerful leader. I don't think that the kind of hostility that's built up against China in recent years is going to go away very quickly. In relation to Russia, it's already been clear that the Sunak government is going to maintain the strong support from Ukraine. There's even been speculation that Boris Johnson will be appointed as a special envoy for Ukraine, which would be, let's face it, rather interesting to watch. Imagine a Johnson and Zelensky trying to make policy together. So I'd say continuity in foreign policy is the more likely direction, not just from the Truss government, not even from the Johnson government, but from the long run of the British approach towards the rest of the world. As Nicholas has said, the big question is what Britain does next about Europe, because we've had this very strange, what you might call phony war between the two sides, fighting over almost irrelevant things like fish and not addressing the big questions of how to improve the relationship. To me, that is going to be the big, it's now foreign policy. It used to almost be domestic policy, but it's the big foreign policy question, including, and I'm sure Nicholas will have something to say on this, what you do next about the odd position that Northern Ireland finds itself in.
Well, on that, Nicholas, of course.
There is a serious issue coming up in the next day, I think, about Northern Ireland. And the question is whether the British will call fresh elections, because after the election in May, there was no formation of a regional government. And the law says that if no regional government is formed, then there must be a fresh election. And the reason the government has not been formed is that one of the political parties, the second biggest party, refuses to participate until the UK and the EU have negotiated new rules for how the border between the two parts of Ireland should work in future. It's unrealistic to see this happening before the deadline arrives for the elections. It may be unrealistic to see it happening at all. My understanding is that actually under Truss, despite the fact that she herself was a hardliner, that the foreign minister and the Northern Ireland minister were moving towards a more pragmatic approach with the European Union. The fact that both of them have stayed in office, to me, indicates that that pragmatism is going to continue. Right. But just being pragmatic doesn't guarantee success. This is a genuinely difficult issue. There is a lack of trust in Europe because Boris Johnson had negotiated a deal which he said he was going to stick by, and then he went back on it. So the British have got a certain amount of credibility to restore here. On the whole, I am more optimistic now than I was 6 months ago about this, but we have lost 6 months in which other things could have been done, in which energies could have been directed more productively. Yeah. I think it's underestimated just how important this issue is for the Europeans. They don't care so much about Northern Ireland themselves, but how the UK treats its closest European neighbour is going to be seen as a very important indicator for how the UK treats Europe as a whole.
Professor Begg, at a time of dramatic changes, among the very complex pictures of geopolitics, where do you think today's UK is? How much energy is there for the UK, even with this new administration, to deal with, the layered down complexities of latest developments for geopolitics?
But I don't think the values have changed. They remain broadly the same. The UK has often been accused of being mid-Atlantic because it's pulled by the United States, but it's also been pulled by Europe. And the trouble with being mid-Atlantic is it's a very deep ocean, and you risk falling into it. You don't want to be stuck in the middle of the ocean all the time. I would say that the big next direction, as both Nicholas and I have been saying before, for the UK is to repair its relationships with the European Union, to try to find a way to use its undoubted military capability and its influence, particularly in relation to Ukraine, as a means by which it can assert its position in the world. It's very easy to be dismissive of the UK, and some of us even as citizens of the country are likely to do this. But we shouldn't forget that the UK remains one of the largest economies in the world. It's one of only two countries in Europe with a significant military capability, along with France. And that influence, if it works with our European colleagues and allies, is going to be far greater than if we try to be totally independent and sit in the middle of the Atlantic with nobody paying attention to us.
Professor Wang?
Well, I think UK is still respected in China for three reasons. Firstly, we say China with the process of the great regeneration. We're building the China path to the modernization, but industrialization, modernization began from UK, Great Britain. So still can teach many things to China. And secondly, China now go to abroad from the continental civilization to maritime. Britain definitely is a maritime power. And thirdly, China now launched the BRI from even traditionally the all under haven, actually is the Eastern Asia, but now it's very global China. So maybe we can also learn from global Britain and how to be the global power with enough balance of the soft power and hard power. Actually, with many things we can learn from UK. And actually, China, what China needs is software. But we are very maybe advanced now in the hardware. So it's very complementary.
So you're suggesting China can learn certainly a lot also from the UK as well as the world changes?
I'm not as optimistic, I have to be honest. I think that there was a high point in UK-China relations under Prime Minister Cameron, and Prime Minister Cameron's legacy on foreign policy was generally not positive because of Brexit. It was he who called the referendum and lost the referendum on staying in the EU, but also his general approach to dealings with the EU was visibly unsuccessful. And rightly or wrongly, I think that for a lot of people in the UK, his openness towards China is seen as another one of his mistakes. And there hasn't been the same level of interest in re-engaging with China under his successors, under Theresa May, under Boris Johnson, under Liz Truss.
Final question. Rishi Sunak, the new Prime Minister, certainly has a very diversified family and cultural background related to Africa, to India, and of course to the UK as well. Do people see this as a rare phenomenon?
It's almost unremarkable in Britain that somebody of Asian descent should become Prime Minister. And it's also unremarkable that it's in the Conservative Party, which you normally think of as being very much traditional and not accepting innovation. And yet, if you consider the Conservative Party, it's had 3 female prime ministers. The previous government, even though it was only short-lived by Liz Truss, had 1 white man at the top of the hierarchy of the government. In the new government, 2 of the other senior ministers are, and I regret having to use this expression, people of colour. So I think that diversity is something that, in a very strange way, has become almost normal in the way that the British approach politics, whereas it would be remarkable in many other countries. Think of France or of Germany. Can you imagine a French president being someone of Sunak's background, or Germany having a chancellor who is of Sunak's background? I think it's still highly unlikely in these other countries. And that's why I think that we should almost celebrate the fact that it's not remarkable in the UK. Actually,
it's a very hot topic in China about the transition of the Tony Tan office, because it's India, and the British, of course, be the new prime minister, and also the U.S. Vice President also is India American, so it's really rise of India. This year also historic for the maybe the shift of the power. The Indians' GDP overtake UK as a number 5th, I think, number 5 in the world. So why the British or the West recognize rise of India but not so much approve of the rise of China.
Interesting. I see very much Chinese cultural perspective in this about the family ties to the homeland. It's a very interesting way of looking at things. And also, I want to have the views of Professor White, please.
Sure. I just want to make the point that the UK is not the first or even the second European country to have a Prime Minister of Indian origin. The Prime Minister of Portugal, Mr. Da Costa, his family is from Goa. Mr. Varadkar, his father is all from India. So, the British have got there where certain other European countries have already been. And Ian Begg mentioned Germany. It's worth bearing in mind that at the election before last, the Free Democrats, one of the major German political parties, went into the election with a leader who was born in Vietnam. The German Minister of Agriculture is a former leader of the German Green Party, Cem Özdemir, who is from Turkey. So we're seeing this is a general shift within Europe, which, to be honest, is not that strange from a global perspective. Look at South America, has had a president from Brazil recently. Look at Peru, less recently had a president from Japan.
Do you want to respond, Professor Begg, to Professor Wang's question?
Yes, it's true that India, let's face it, it's not surprising with a population of 1.4 billion compared with Britain's 70 billion, should be overtaking the UK as the fifth leading economy in the world. But we should again be pleased about that, because it shows that economic development at last is functioning. India had been a laggard for a long time, and to see it progressing is good news.
With that, we're wrapping up today's discussion. Thank you so much, Ian Begg, Nicholas White, and Wang Yiwei. Thank you, gentlemen. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. See you tomorrow.